They thought I was slipping. They thought the old man had finally lost his edge. I remember standing in the driveway that Tuesday afternoon, my hands still on the car door, listening. The house was supposed to be empty. My daughter had told me she was taking my wife to her book club. My son-in-law had said he'd be at work until 6, but there were 2 unfamiliar cars parked along the curb, a silver Lexus and a white Cadillac, and I could hear laughter coming through the open kitchen window. Not quiet laughter, the kind of laughter that belongs to people who believe no one is watching. I stood there for a moment. Then I walked around to the side gate instead of the front door. My wife was sitting alone in the sunroom. She didn't see me right away. She was facing the window with her hands folded in her lap, and she was crying, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, the way a person cries when they've been crying for a while and have run out of the energy to do it any other way. Her shoulders were curved inward. She looked smaller than I remembered. I pushed open the door and she turned, and when she saw me, something in her face broke open all at once. "Roberts," she said, "just my name. Nothing else." I sat down next to her and took her hands. They were cold. "Tell me," I said. She shook her head. "They're still inside." "I know," I said. "Tell me anyway." I should back up. "My name is Robert Callahan. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer for the county, designed bridges and drainage systems and overpasses that are still standing today. My wife, Carol, and I have been married for 42 years. We raised 2 children in the house we built together in Claremont, California. Our son, David, who lives in Portland with his family and calls every Sunday, and our daughter, Melissa. Melissa is 41. She works in pharmaceutical sales, drives a company car, and has what I would call an ambitious personality. I mean that carefully. Ambition itself is not a flaw. Carol and I encouraged it. We paid for her undergraduate degree at USC and her MBA at Pepperdine. We were proud of her. She married a man named Craig Fowler 9 years ago. Craig is pleasant enough in the way that certain people are pleasant, smoothly, selectively, in ways that cost him nothing. He works in commercial real estate. He has a firm handshake and good teeth and opinions about wine that he shares, whether you ask or not. His parents are Glenn and Patrice Fowler. They live in Rancho Cucamonga, about 20 minutes from us. Glenn owned a chain of dry cleaning businesses that he sold several years ago for what Craig once described, without being asked, as a very comfortable number. Patrice volunteers at their church and hosts what she calls a salon, a monthly dinner where she invites people she considers interesting and seats them in order of what she considers importance. Carol and I had been to the Fowler house twice. Both times, Patrice had introduced Carol to other guests as Craig's mother-in-law's mother. It took Carol a moment to realize she meant herself. I mention all of this because it matters. It matters for what came later. It matters for understanding what was happening in my kitchen that afternoon while my wife sat alone in the sunroom and cried. The trouble had started, as it often does, quietly. About 8 months before that Tuesday, Melissa had come to us with a proposal. She and Craig had been renting a place in Upland for several years, she explained. The market was difficult. They were thinking about the future. Our house. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, on a corner lot in a neighborhood that had appreciated considerably since we bought it in 1989, was, she said, underutilized. That was the word she used. Underutilized. Carol and I exchanged a glance across the dinner table. "We're using it," I said. Melissa smiled. "Of course. I just mean, it's a big house for 2 people. And Craig and I have been talking about starting a family. Eventually. And it would be so much more practical." "What would be practical?" Carol asked. "Living together. A multi-generational arrangement. Lots of families do it. It makes financial sense, and honestly, it would be nice to have you closer." I asked her what specifically she had in mind. She explained that she and Craig would move into the main house. Carol and I would have full use of the guest suite. It had a separate entrance, she reminded us, its own bathroom, a small sitting area. She called it a private cottage feel. She said this with the confidence of someone who has rehearsed the phrase. I said I would think about it. Over the following weeks, she brought it up again and again, each time with slightly more urgency, slightly more scaffolding. Craig had found an architect who could open up the kitchen. The school district was excellent for future children. It would be good for us to have someone nearby as we got older. That last point landed with particular precision, as we got older. As if the guest suite was not a downgrade, but a kindness. Carol told me she felt uncomfortable. I told her I understood. What I didn't tell her, what I didn't tell anyone, was that I had already made a phone call. 2 weeks after Melissa's first proposal, I had called a man named Arthur Finch. Arthur had been my attorney for 19 years. He was 72, semi-retired, and sharper than anyone I had ever met in a courtroom or out of one. I had used him for our estate planning, for a property dispute with a neighbor that resolved quickly once Arthur sent a single letter, and for the purchase of a small rental property in Fontana that I had acquired 12 years earlier and never mentioned to my children. I told Arthur what Melissa had proposed. I told him about Craig. I told him about Glenn and Patrice Fowler and the Rancho Cucamonga house, and the way Patrice seated dinner guests. Arthur listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Robert, what does your gut tell you?" I told him my gut told me that my daughter loved me, but that she had married a man whose relationship to other people's assets was professionally complicated, and that his parents had raised him to believe that comfort was something you arranged rather than earned. Arthur said, "All right, let's talk about what you want to protect." I eventually told Melissa yes. I want to be honest about that. I said yes, and I meant it as a trial. A chance to see whether my concerns were misplaced, whether Craig would prove me wrong, whether the arrangement could work. Carol was hesitant but willing. She loved Melissa. She wanted to believe the best. They moved in on a Saturday in March. Craig's parents came to help, which mostly meant Glenn stood in the driveway offering commentary, while Craig and 2 hired movers carried boxes, and Patrice walked through the rooms of our house with the focused attention of someone taking inventory. I watched her pause in the dining room, run her hand along the edge of the table we'd had for 20 years, look up at the light fixture, look back down. "This could be beautiful with some updating," she said to Melissa, not to me. Carol heard it from the kitchen. I said nothing. The first 3 months were manageable. Melissa was often traveling for work. Craig was cordial. We ate dinner together on Fridays, and the conversation stayed on safe ground. I let myself wonder if I'd been too suspicious. Then came the 4th of July weekend. Glenn and Patrice came to stay for 3 days. They brought a bottle of wine and opinions about the backyard. By Sunday afternoon, Glenn was describing to Craig in the living room, within my hearing, a conversation he had apparently already had with a contractor friend about the cost of adding a second master suite over the garage. He said the square footage would be a good investment. He said, a good investment, as if the house were a mutual fund they had recently acquired. I sat in the armchair with my book open and did not look up. After that weekend, things accelerated. Craig began working from home more often. He took calls in the dining room, occasionally the study. Once I came downstairs at 6 in the morning and found him at my desk, not his laptop on the kitchen table where he usually sat, but at my actual desk, in my actual chair, with the desk drawers slightly open. He said he'd been looking for a stapler. He smiled the smile with the good teeth. I said I kept my staplers upstairs. I smiled back. Melissa started bringing up the Fontana rental property. She'd heard me mention it once, years ago. She asked if I'd considered selling it. The market was strong, she said, and the proceeds could go toward improvements to the main property. I said I hadn't considered it. She mentioned it again 2 weeks later. Then Craig mentioned it, casually, over dinner. I called Arthur Finch. Then came the morning about a month before that Tuesday in the sunroom. Melissa told me she'd made an appointment with a financial advisor, not mine, a new one, someone Craig knew, to do a comprehensive review of the family's assets. She said it as if that were a normal sentence. She said it over breakfast, with the same voice she used to tell me what time her flight to Phoenix was landing. I said that sounded fine. I said I might have a conflict that day. The appointment happened without me. Carol went because Melissa asked her to, and because Carol has always found it very difficult to say no to our daughter. When Carol came home, she told me the advisor had asked detailed questions about the house title, about my pension, about whether I had a will and when it had last been updated. She said it had felt less like a financial review and more like, she searched for the word, an audit. That night I called Arthur again. "It's moving faster than I expected," I said. "How fast?" he said. I told him. There was a pause. Then Arthur said, "Robert, it's time. I need to explain something about my house before I continue. When Carol and I bought the property in 1989, we paid for it with a combination of our savings, a modest inheritance from my father, and a 30-year mortgage that we paid off in 22. The house is in both our names. What it is not, what it has never been, though no one outside of Arthur's office knows this, is unprotected. 14 years ago, when I first began doing serious estate planning, Arthur and I established what he called a revocable living trust. The trust holds the house, the Fontana rental property, and a portion of my retirement savings. Carol and I are the trustees while we are living. The terms of the trust are specific. Arthur had drafted a clause. We had debated it, refined it, and eventually included it that addressed what he called predatory transfer attempts. His language, precise as always. The clause stated that if any beneficiary of the trust, or any person acting on behalf of the beneficiary, attempted to transfer, encumber, renegotiate, or otherwise exert unauthorized control over any trust asset during the lifetime of the trustees, that beneficiary's interest in the trust would be permanently revoked, not reduced, not delayed. Revoked. Arthur called it a self-executing provision. The attempt itself was the trigger. No court proceeding required, no lengthy legal battle. The moment the attempt was made and documented, the clause activated. Melissa was named as a beneficiary. So was David. Neither of them knew the trust existed. Neither of them knew about the clause. I had not told Carol about the clause either, not because I didn't trust her, but because Carol cannot conceal things from people she loves, and I needed the clause to function as it was designed. Arthur had advised me, about 6 weeks before that Tuesday, to install a small document camera in my study, visible enough to be legitimate, positioned to capture the desk area. It had been there for 5 weeks when Craig sat down at my desk looking for a stapler. It had been there when, on the Thursday before that Tuesday, Craig had opened my bottom desk drawer, the one I had begun leaving unlocked, and photographed several documents with his phone. The documents were real. They described a property trust. They contained an address for a bank I had never actually used. Arthur had prepared them specifically for this purpose. We had spent 2 hours on the phrasing. Craig had photographed 6 pages. I knew this because of the camera. I knew about the appointment he had made at that bank for the following Monday, because Arthur had a contact there who owed him a favor, and because Craig had been less careful with his email than he perhaps should have been. I knew on that Tuesday afternoon, when I stood in my driveway listening to laughter come through the kitchen window, exactly what I was walking into. I just needed one more thing. Carol told me what had happened while I sat next to her in the sunroom. Glenn and Patrice had arrived that morning, unannounced, while Carol was in the middle of a phone call with her sister. Melissa had let them in, clearly expecting them. Craig was there too, home from work. The 4 of them had gathered in the kitchen. Patrice had spread papers across the kitchen table, Carol's kitchen table, and had begun talking about renovation timelines. A contractor was apparently coming Thursday. The guest suite where Carol and I slept, our bedroom, which they called the guest suite, which was the whole of what they had offered us when they proposed this arrangement, was going to be repurposed. Patrice used the word repurposed. She had looked at Carol while she said it, and had not changed her expression. There was a retirement community in Glendora, Melissa explained. Very nice. Carol would love it. They had a garden and organized activities. She had already requested a tour for next week. She said this with the calm certainty of someone announcing a done thing. Carol had stood at her own kitchen table and listened to this. Then she had walked to the sunroom. She had been there for 2 hours when I pulled into the driveway. I held her hands, and I let her finish. I did not tell her about the trust. I did not tell her about Arthur, or the camera, or the bank appointment that Craig had kept on Monday and that had not gone the way Craig expected. I said, "Go upstairs and get changed. We're going out to dinner tonight." She looked at me. "What about?" "I'll handle what's in the kitchen," I said. I want to describe that moment in the kitchen carefully, because it's the part I have replayed most in the months since. Glenn was at the counter with a mug of coffee, my mugs, my counter. Patrice was seated at the table with reading glasses on, annotating something in a folder. Craig was leaning against the refrigerator with his arms folded. Melissa was standing near the window, and when I walked in, she turned with the slightly overlit expression of someone who has rehearsed a difficult conversation and is relieved to finally have it. "Dad," she said. "You're home early." "I am," I said. I sat down at the table, not across from Patrice, but next to her, close enough that she had to shift the folder slightly. I rested my hands flat on the table. "I'd like to see what you're working on," I said. There was a pause. Glenn set down his mug. Craig unfolded his arms. Patrice said, with a kind of patient condescension that I suspected she used on contractors and waitstaff, "Robert, we were just going over some preliminary ideas. Nothing to get worked up about." "I'm not worked up," I said. "I'm curious." I looked at Melissa. "Sit down, sweetheart." She sat. I said, "I know about Monday." Craig's expression shifted. Just slightly, just around the eyes, but I've been reading civil engineering blueprints for 30 years, and I know how to find the stress point in a structure. "Craig went to First Consolidated on Monday," I said. "He had an appointment. He brought documentation about a property trust. He told the banker that I had authorized him to begin a transfer discussion." I paused. He had not been authorized. And the trust he brought documentation about, those documents were not the real trust. The kitchen was very quiet. "There is a real trust," I continued. "Arthur Finch has managed it for 14 years. It holds this house, the rental property in Fontana, and a portion of my retirement savings. The trust contains a clause. The clause states that any attempt by a beneficiary to exert unauthorized control over trust assets during my lifetime results in permanent revocation of that beneficiary's interest." I watched Melissa's face. "The attempt was made on Monday," I said. "Arthur confirmed the revocation yesterday morning." Patrice took off her reading glasses. Glenn had gone very still. Craig was looking at a point somewhere between the refrigerator and the floor. Melissa said very quietly, "Dad." "I'm not finished," I said. I looked at Glenn and Patrice. "I want to thank you for being here today. I mean that sincerely. I needed witnesses, and you saved me the trouble of scheduling a separate conversation." I looked back at my daughter. "Melissa, I love you. I have loved you since before you could speak, and I will love you long after today. But I need you to understand what has happened." I laid it out for her. All of it. The financial advisor meeting. The questions about the title, Craig at my desk, the documents, the camera, Arthur's preparation, the bank appointment, Monday's meeting, which had ended with a banker calling Arthur's office because the man presenting the documents couldn't answer basic questions about the trust's actual structure. I spoke for about 15 minutes. I did not raise my voice. When I finished, Patrice said, "This is an overreaction." It was the wrong thing to say, and something in the room shifted when she said it. "Glenn," I said, "does your house have a trust?" He blinked. "That's not. Does it have a clause like mine?" He didn't answer. "Then I would suggest," I said, "that you make sure the people who stand to benefit from it are not currently sitting in someone else's kitchen, planning a renovation." Craig and Melissa moved out 3 weeks later. It took less time than their move-in. There was a period, several weeks, where Melissa did not call. Then she called, once, and we talked for a long time. She cried. I let her. She said she hadn't known about Monday. I told her I believed her because I did. Craig had operated on his own, with his parents, and Melissa had been useful to their plan without being fully inside it. That distinction mattered to me. I told her it didn't change the legal reality, but it changed how I spoke to her. She is still my daughter. She calls on Sundays now, like David does. We have had dinner, just the two of us, twice since then. It is careful and a little formal and occasionally painful, the way repairs are before they're finished. Craig is a harder question. I don't have an answer for Craig yet. David, when I finally told him the full story, was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Dad, how long did you know?" I told him 14 years, more or less. That the clause had been there since Arthur drafted it, waiting for something I hoped would never come. David said, "And you never told Mom?" "No," I said. He thought about that. And then he said, "She's okay." "She's good," I said. "She's in the garden." The contractor Patrice had scheduled for Thursday never came, because I called the number in her folder on Wednesday morning and canceled the appointment. I gave my name as the property owner. The woman on the phone said, "Oh, Mr. Callahan, we were told you'd already approved the scope of work." I said I hadn't. She said that was fine and canceled it without any fuss. I stood in the kitchen after that call, in the quiet of a house that was ours again, and looked at the table where Patrice had spread her papers. Carol's kitchen, Carol's table. The light coming through the window the same way it had for 35 years. There's a particular kind of relief that doesn't feel like celebration. It just feels like stillness, like something that had been held at an angle, finally setting level. I made 2 cups of coffee and brought one out to the sunroom. Carol was reading. She looked up and took the mug and said, "What are you smiling about?" "Nothing," I said. "Just glad to be home." She looked at me for a moment with the expression she's had for 42 years, the one that means she knows I'm not telling her everything, and she's decided that's all right for now. "Sit down," she said. "I'll tell you what happened in my book." I sat down. Outside, the garden was doing what it always does in October in Southern California, holding on to the last of the warmth, the bougainvillea still heavy against the fence, the light going gold in the late afternoon. The silver Lexus and the white Cadillac were gone. The driveway was empty. The house was ours. It had always been ours. They just hadn't understood, until Monday, exactly what that meant. There's one more thing I want to say, for anyone listening who recognizes something in this story. Not the legal details, not the trust or the clause or the paperwork, but the feeling underneath it. The feeling of watching people you love begin to see you as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. The feeling of sitting in a room where decisions about your life are being made without you. I want you to know that feeling is not a sign you've lost. It's a sign you're paying attention. My father used to say that the most dangerous thing a man can do is let other people decide what he's worth. He said it about work, mostly, about contractors lowballing bids and bosses taking credit. But I've thought about it differently over the years. I've thought about it in terms of how much space you're willing to hold for yourself when the people around you start measuring the walls. I measured first. That's the whole story, really. I measured first. And then I waited. And when they finally brought their numbers to the table, mine were already there.